Okay. Hi, welcome back, everybody. I'm Brett Norton with Beyond Clean once again, and I would like to once again thank our sponsor, 3M, and our event collaborator, First Case, for the nursing credits. Couldn't do it without you guys, so really appreciate it, and really excited to be presenting on behalf of 3M for this conference and offering such great education, which is invaluable to our industry. One of the things I do want to remind everybody and just to point out once again is we do have a resource window in the right-hand corner of your screen. There is bonus CE content available, so you can hop on in and click in and listen for an hour and get your CE for that. So there's 4 extra CEs available on top of what we're offering today. We also have a how to access CE certificate. It's a resource for obtaining the CE certificate. So please make sure to reference that if you have any questions on grabbing your CE. And we also have some sponsor provided brochures from 3M and product information. I want to introduce our next speaker, Melissa Morgan. She is the Senior Director of Infection Prevention and Control at Orlando Health. She has over 12 years of experience in infection prevention and has a clinical background in nursing. Melissa has been recognized as APIC's North Carolina Practitioner of the Year and has been honored with several nursing awards. Her presentation title is Reducing Audit Culture and Process Monitoring. What is the difference between process monitoring and auditing? What role should sterile processing and infection prevention departments play in process improvement strategies? Melissa's here to discuss the key differences between process monitoring and auditing and identify why SPDs should move away from the traditional audit culture. Looking forward to this one. Melissa, welcome, and we'll be seeing you on the other side.
Thank you so much, Brett. I do appreciate the opportunity to talk to you guys today, and I hope that you enjoy this presentation and look forward to the questions at the end. So let's get started. So reducing audit culture and process monitoring. So here at Orlando Health, we have a mission to improve the health and quality of life of the individuals and the communities in which we serve. We have several key strategies in which Orlando Health functions and directs our group. And so this is also very beneficial as I have the opportunity to reach outside the Orlando Health family and talk to you at the national and international level. Much like many of you in your roles and organizations, I'm sure your goals are associated with embracing quality and safety, committed to team member or employee loyalty, having the best place to work, being innovative, strengthening our economy and our healthcare service infrastructure, as well as servicing our customers well. So a little bit about the Orlando Health System. We are located in Central Florida. We stretch down the I-4 or International 4 Highway corridor from Daytona Beach down to St. Petersburg, Florida. We are a large integrated health system. We have 10 award-winning hospitals, a physician faculty of more than 4,200 physicians, 100 medical practices and specialties. We have 15, we just actually opened our 16th freestanding emergency department. We have 9 medical pavilions, 14 urgent care facilities. We are Central Florida's only level 1 trauma center, and we are a huge team working to support the care amongst Floridians. We also have the benefit of being located right here at Walt Disney World, where we get an annual of about 70,000 visitors to this area each and every day. Our organization has been recognized as Watson's top hospitals. We've won many U.S. News and World awards and recognitions as we do strive to ensure our care is the best. So I'm an infection preventionist. What in the world would make me a good topic or person to speak to you in sterile processing? Well, first of all, I have to tell you that I love sterile processing. I believe that you are the infrastructure for how we keep our patients safe. I believe in the staff. I believe in the structures in which the department functions. And I believe that you are the original infection preventionist. I've had the honor and privilege to work with many sterile processing departments, not only in North Carolina, where I worked for many years, but also on the West Coast, servicing hospitals in Hawaii, California, and Oregon, along with our teams here at Orlando Health in Florida. Many times infection preventionists are seen as either the hand hygiene police, but also those individuals who have the innate ability to find all of our weaknesses, and that partnership can oftentimes be very gruff or not collaborative. And I'm hoping today that I can help create a culture with this conversation about how we become great partners and bond us as we move forward in the future. So for today's objectives, I really want to help each of us understand the differences between auditing and process monitoring, understand our partnership and how we drive and establish that culture, describe ways to encourage process improvement utilizing Lean or Six Sigma methodologies that include visual management and standard work, and then describe strategies to establish a culture of collaboration internally and externally. So here's how your day starts. There's an overhead announcement. Good morning. Please join us in welcoming, and you can insert now any regulatory body that usually visits your facilities, and the following announcement that they will be touring each of our facilities for the next few days. And what does that tour usually mean? It's usually around what we call audits, right? An audit is defined as an official inspection of someone's accounts. Auditing has historically been associated in the finance category as we do things like balancing our checkbook. However, in the regulatory world, auditing is a way of looking at the processes, evaluating that against what our policy is, and determining what gaps exist. Now, the function of an audit is really to determine reliability and integrity. It's supposed to show us that what we're doing is effective and efficient. It does instill levels of compliance. You know, if we say we do something, are we truly doing it? And then it also works to ensure that safeguards are there, that the reason why we say we do it one way creates a safe environment or gets us to the outcome in which we are trying to achieve. But in my mind, audits never really feel like they're in a positive way. And why is that? Well, I don't know about many of you, and maybe this isn't true, but in my experience, when we learn that someone from a regulatory body is in our building, immediately the organization behaves differently. No longer is everybody doing their work streams. All of a sudden, everybody who you have possibly ever heard of or know about is out and about in the organization. To me, the stress becomes palpable, almost like we're in a crisis. Even though people may be speaking calmly to each other, you can almost guarantee you can feel the stress level. Leaders that you may have never seen before show up, start asking you questions, trying to understand processes that they may have never asked questions about previously. Every leader immediately knows where their weaknesses are, and they begin to laser focus into ensuring that all our I's are dotted and our T's are crossed. If you're in sterile process and you know for a fact that that's when every chemical log and any other process that has documentation associated with it starts becoming your major focus. and any little stray mark may be questioned or criticized. And of course, at that time, everybody is really key into what our competencies and instructions for use are. They begin to ask and dissect questions that sometimes make us wonder where they've been every day of what we do. And why? Why is it like this? Why do people behave this way? And I think it has to do with our culture. Culture is something that we all talk about. It's something that we focus on. We pride ourselves in our culture, in our departments, and across our organizations. Sometimes it can be a catchphrase, but when you talk about regulatory bodies coming to talk to you about what you do every day, there's a sense of culture that you're going to be punished, that they will find something, that will result in a problem that then many people have to solve. And so there's an intensity associated with it. It's all about focusing those behaviors and that conduct in a way in which we can help not have a culture where this is intense in a one moment opportunity. We really want a culture where we're worried about these things every day, and we have processes in place to help us avoid those gaps every day, not just when someone comes to ask questions. The culture around audits really has to do with how we engage our staff. If a staff member has never seen me as a leader and all of a sudden during a regulatory visit that leader shows up, you immediately have some opportunity to turn the staff off. You're asking questions that they're not used to. They should be used to you asking questions. They should be used to you understanding. They should be used to your partnership. So if we've never shown up and all of a sudden when a regulatory body does, we do, that can create some negative impact. Of course, all of this has to do with our patients and how we impact them, as well as our outcome measures as we prevent harm moving forward. So we need to get away from that influence of urgency. Leadership has to realize that they don't have the answers to our questions or our ways of fixing our opportunities. And we need to implement this change quicker and sooner than later. Because if we do shift the culture from an audit focus to more of a collaborative process focus, we now become prepared each and every day. Our staff become vital pieces of the puzzle. They know what's wrong in the process. They know what's hard in the process, and they can help us identify and correct. Staff end up teaching each other. They hold each other accountable, and they create a team member dynamic that is unstoppable, in my opinion. Because when team members get to own their process and feel empowered to make sure their process is meeting the outcomes they have set as a team, you just can't turn that around. You can't stop that because it creates a self-rewarding behavior. And I don't know about you, but I really like to do things where I feel positive about the outcomes. I do not want to do something and feel like I had no success at the end of my day. So how do we do this? I think we need to stop doing audits. Anytime anyone says the word audit to me, I immediately change their language to process monitoring. I don't audit anything. What I want to do is look at a process, make sure that that process is clear, that everyone understands the expectations, they have an opportunity to give feedback and engage, and then there are visuals that tell us how we're doing in that process. Not in a disciplinary or accountable way, but in a way of knowing that what I'm doing and what I expect is reaching success. Sometimes we refer to process monitoring as continuous monitoring. It shouldn't just be done once a month, once a day, but this is done every day, all the time, every time we're doing the process. It's ongoing. It should always evaluate and seek the feedback of those involved in the process and allow for continual improvement. If I'm a team member, I know what makes it hard. And we often in healthcare have to change methodologies. We get new equipment, we get new resources. In the wake of COVID, we have all experienced disruptions in our supply chain, and we need to engage those staff members that are doing the work to understand if our alternatives are meeting the needs or have we made that work harder. And all in all, this encourages participation. If I'm a part of the problem, then I can also be a part of the solution because I am the process. I am one of those individuals that is forever engaged in that work. And how does that differ? Well, audits, all in all, they're always done to us, right? Somebody who doesn't do our work every day is coming in telling us how we're doing. In process monitoring, we do all that work. We know how we're performing, we see our opportunities, and we talk about it and create solutions. Audits are always focused on a prescriptive set of standards. We have no control over that standard. In process monitoring, we set the standard. We set where we're going to go, and then we increase that standard till we get to perfection. For me, audits feel like a grade. Did I get an A today? Did I get a C today? Did I get an F today? But in a process monitor, I have ownership, and I can also help establish some friendly competition, right? Because ultimately, we all want to be the best of the best. And so by being able to create that ownership, I can also create good competition and continual striving. And audits always result in an action plan. How many people today can say that they are currently a part of an action plan? Right? Every day, somebody's saying, well, this didn't go right, so here's your action plan. In process monitoring, we don't need an action plan because we're doing this every day. We're seeking improvement every day, and there's no question. There's no stopping us. So how can we set a standard? A great industry standard has been using Lean or Six Sigma methodologies for improvement. And I'm hoping many of you are already aware of some of these strategies. It usually starts with establishing standard work, which involves the people doing the work. They get to talk about what the process is. They get input into writing that process. They work together to solve the problems. And of course, this ultimately supports improvement because as this process continues, they are continually looking to say, could we do this better? Could we do this more efficiently? Is there something that would make this work easier? And all of those things are at the foundational structure of standard work. If there is no standard work, how in the world do you assess for gaps? I have no idea because the rules are not clear to everyone. So even in an audit, the overarching work doesn't necessarily talk about how it's done. And we'll talk about that a little bit more in just a few minutes. For me, when you create standard work, you also don't limit creativity. You know, staff really understand what they're doing every day. And if they don't, standard work helps them to understand that. But they also can get creative, and it gives them an empowerment that by giving somebody instructions does not do. And all recipes are always continually perfected, right? We do something, doesn't quite work. We go back to the drawing board, we tweak it a little bit, maybe we add a little bit more salt, maybe we take away a little bit more, or we take away a little salt, and we get to what we call the perfect product. But that is a continual force to be reckoned with and something that we need to actively pursue. So when I talk about standard work, I think the best example for me is talking about how we make a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, right? Like this is the nuts and the bolts of it. Because a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, that seems really simple, right? However, when we stop to think about it, do we all make a peanut butter and jelly sandwich the same way? Do you use one knife for both the peanut butter and the jelly? Do you use a knife for peanut butter and a separate knife for jelly? Do you use one knife and you put peanut butter on your one side of the bread, and then maybe you lick the knife and then get the jelly? I won't tell anybody or any of my infection prevention friends that I said that, of course, because I'm sure I just grossed out several people. But we do know that when we have our own house, sometimes we take those liberties. But do you put peanut butter on both sides of the bread or just in the middle? Do you put it on half of one slice or the other? But ultimately, when we get to the end, each and every one's peanut butter and jelly sandwich, although it fits under the category of peanut butter and jelly sandwich, was all made differently and gets to the same result, although some may not be as neat as others. And isn't that what an audit finds? Is when that peanut butter and jelly sandwich is a little bit messier or not exactly up to the standard in which I'm seeking. Now let's talk about peanut butter jelly in a way that probably most of you can relate, because you probably don't make peanut butter and jelly sandwiches every day. Let's talk about IFUs, instructions for use. This is one of the things that I am determined to continue to fight for, because our instructions for use can get us in more trouble than they can help in some cases. So I'm thinking about some of the instructions for use that I've read in the past, specifically around decontamination. They say things like vigorously flush channels, flush air from the lumens, remove the soil. However, that can be done in a multitude of ways, right? There's no prescriptiveness in those IFUs. However, if that IFU says flush lumens until water runs clear, is that more descriptive? Does that create a better standard than vigorously flush channels? Would it also help if it said to flush at least 10 cc's of air through the lumen versus just saying flush air from the lumen? And what about when you have to remove soil? Should it tell you which brush to use in order to give you more standards and expectations that are clearer for each of us to follow? I think so. I think that our industries owe us this description. They owe us the assistance in our standard work. However, when not, we as a department own the opportunity to set that for ourselves. We know what gets us to that outcome, right? So we may say that you need to flush those lumens for at least 30 seconds with water in this sink. That is even more of an expected standard that could drive us to the outcome in which we are trying to keep our patients safe. So, of course, sterile processing and infection prevention have a long history around audits, right? I mean, this is not new to any of us. We all have participated in audits, and we've all done some process monitoring. One item that I think of that most everybody I'm aware of monitors is process monitoring around immediate use steam sterilization. This is something that many teams for many years have owned. They look at it. They are required to report it to infection prevention committees at healthcare systems. Infection prevention, as well as auditors externally and internally, will oftentimes ask for this. And many of us have been on a journey to eliminate and limit this by understanding the why and recognizing that, you know, you really can eliminate immediate use steam sterilization almost 99% of the time. But how would we make this process monitoring? So for me, I'm used to people giving me IUSS data on a monthly basis. That rings true for an audit methodology, not for a process monitoring methodology. By providing data such as this in the graph, this is a quarterly index of why IUSS was done. What kind of actions can I take on that a month out or even 3 months out from the data versus if I had insight into this data each and every day? Can the team monitor and reduce these variances immediately? Absolutely. If we moved IUSS to more of a process monitoring infrastructure versus just looking at this data at a high level. And this is where I think infection prevention has an opportunity to partner with sterile processing differently. If all I do as an infection prevention department is receive this data and report it out and ask questions monthly or quarterly, I am failing that team. I am failing to present myself as a collaborator and someone who can lift the barriers that the team members have in making sure that they're not forced to do something that all of them understand may not be necessary every time. Because ultimately, when I do it that way, it feels like an audit. So how would I empower you to change? First, we have to stop looking at these safety issues monthly. This is more of a routine, day-to-day opportunity to review the processes and implement intervention. We should never just say, oh, you did really bad with your IUSS last month. What are you going to do differently? And what is your action plan? So there it comes. That's where audit, process, and culture becomes a part of your everyday language. What are you going to do differently when I've looked at it on a monthly basis? Versus if I was processing monitoring, the teams themselves would say, today we had 2 IUSS cases. Why did we have them? And what could we have done differently to prevent them moving forward? And the answer may be, people dropped something, so it required IUSS. So you move on. But doesn't mean tomorrow you don't ask the same questions. You don't implement the same responses. You don't continually evaluate and intervene. Because that's where you get to determine your biggest opportunities. Do you have a real breakdown in your standard work? Are people taking advantage of your processes and there's no accountability or no one to support you in the accountability of an established process? I'm sure if I did a poll right now, many of you would tell me you have policies that make vendors bring in instrumentation by a certain time frame. However, there's a lot of accountability that falls into that. And from my experience, what I've noticed is there's always a gray zone where that tray is an exception to the rule, and then before you know it, everybody's the exception to the rule. So how do I do that process change in my department? Well, you've got to identify your key stakeholders. You've got to ensure that you have formal work in place, which includes who's going to be a part of it, who's going to hold each other accountable to the work. You need to establish a success indicator. So what would success look like? It doesn't necessarily have to be a chart, a graph, an award, something to hang on the wall. But what would success look like to the team, and how would they embrace that change? And then you need to make it visual. Anything that's not visual will oftentimes be forgotten, and we'll keep moving. Now, do not create the wallpaper of visuals. So there is a balance between what would be beneficial and what becomes overwhelmed wallpaper. I'm sure nobody's ever been anywhere where there's lots and lots of wallpaper of signs of what we're supposed to do. And us as leaders, we own that process to ensure that we are not overwhelming our team members with wallpaper. So let's talk about how we would possibly redesign IUSS and the standards around it. So from an IUSS standpoint, when you have numbers, you would, of course, figure out, okay, these in my quarterly graph. So let me go back to that graph. In this graph, we've established that TF cases, and so TF stands for to follow, meaning that they're back-to-back cases. And then vendor issues are our low-hanging, high-incidence fruit for what is causing IUSS within our organization. So I've got that data. So now I can pull my team together and say, what issue are we going to work on? maybe to follow cases is not something that we feel like we are empowered as a local team to work on, and it would require key stakeholders outside of our routine group. So maybe that's where we say, but you know what? We have a lot of power and a lot of control over vendors and their ability to not follow our instructions. So the team gets together and they determine that the major vendor issue was that change in procedures were causing vendor instrumentation to not be received within a timely manner. So they recognized that within their data, they were changing the procedure and the instruments were not showing up within 24 hours. So the team says, okay, what can we do differently? We can't change the rules. We still need that 24-hour time frame. So maybe we should do a better job of reviewing our cases to make sure that the assigned instrumentation is appropriate for the case that is going to occur. So let's look at cases 48 hours from date of case. So they implemented a structure where a named individual would start looking at that case. They would determine whether or not it was appropriate and make changes at the 48-hour mark. From then, that communication was key that it reached our vendors. So the standard work included ways to reach the vendor. And then at the 36-hour mark, instrumentation was checked to see if it was in-house versus scheduled. If the instrumentation was not in-house, that gave them a 12-hour window to talk to the parties involved to get the instrumentation or delivery time and date established. And the team decided what is going to be our hard stop. Our policy says if instrumentation is not in the organization within 24 hours, we need to really understand if this case can proceed. We need to have our patients at the center of our focus, and IUSS for that reason is not acceptable. So that involves a lot of leader engagement and a lot of leadership accountability around supporting the teams and making those decisions. So that would be key in this process for process monitoring. So once that is agreed upon, then you can enable action to prevent surgeries from being postponed or canceled at the last minute. So how would they continually monitor it? Well, it really starts by the day-to-day. So the team developed a very quick, and it was not electronic, it was all on paper, actually a whiteboard, where they would talk about how many cases had to be reviewed, how many were actually reviewed, how much instrumentation was in-house, 36 hours, so there was an indicator for that. And then they used metrics to determine whether those numbers were written in green, yellow, or red. And then they also calculated how many cases were at risk for cancellation due to these processes. Because if we start canceling our cases, somebody's going to tell us to stop doing it, right? Because we can't cancel cases. That's our bread and butter to what we do. That's how we run our hospitals. That's how we make money. And so we need to be acutely aware of how much risk we're doing by implementing this process. And so that daily review of metrics allowed for the teams to have everyday discussion about why things were not green. What was not achieved, what was the barrier for why it wasn't achieved, what implemented change or distractions from being able to perform this work. And they were able to take immediate actions. They corrected those gaps on site, in person, in the time frame in which they were dealing with it. And what they realized is that this made actions a lot faster than an action plan, because they were taking real-time, real-life interventions that they could immediately implement without distraction. It also allowed them the opportunity and empowered them with the engagement to stop the line. We don't have it, we can't get it, so we're not going to move forward. And this avoided us disappointing our patients and setting us up for failure by having to cancel cases. And as you can see, during the first week of data collection, they did have some challenges. It was not all green. It was not all roses and sunshine. However, they didn't give up after this first week. They kept pushing. And this is what happened after about 4 weeks of data collection. They noticed that the ability to review each of these cases at the 48-hour mark became more and more attainable. Instrumentation was also becoming more and more available. There was not pushback. There seemed to not be a lot of excuses as we worked and partnered with different groups. And so that became more and more of an easy process, and the time involved to ensure it occurred week by week really dropped down to just a few minutes. And then the cases at risk really made a difference. After several weeks, there were very few cases that it was a hard stop where the group had to huddle to determine what the next steps were, including a conversation with the vendor and the physician. And then IUSS, for vendor instrumentation not ready, actually got to 0 because the process was monitored each and every day versus having a monthly report out with an IUSS rate that was acceptable but not 0. And why does infection prevention play a role in this? Well, it's up to us to not round just once a year or once a quarter. We really need to be engaged with our team members in this space. You are, as sterile processing departments, the infrastructure for patient safety with any procedure or surgical procedure. And so you should see me as your friend, as your partner. You should never hear me say the words audit. I need to understand how you do your work. I need to understand your process, and I need to help you establish ways to monitor that, because that makes me a member of the team and not the police, because I never want to be the police. You know, I think that when I think about infection preventionists, I've often heard them compared to the police, which makes me think about speeding. So, you know, I think all of us have probably ridden over the speed limit or driven over the speed limit at some point in time in our life. We all know it's wrong. We know that if we're supposed to go the posted speed limit. However, just an inch visibility to a police car and all of us drop down to the right speed. And that's not how you want me to be. I don't want to show up and you immediately do what's right and there be reasons for why you were taking shortcuts or variances. I want to be there to partner to help you understand that each and every day. I don't want to be the police where all of a sudden you drive the speed limit. I want to be that person that says, you know, this team can't do what's right for X, Y, and Z. And I want to help you relieve or alleviate those challenges. And that would help you lift those barriers, because infection prevention and sterile processing partnered together can definitely move mountains. You know, it gives us an opportunity to have a voice outside of just operative services, and it can give some visibility all the way up to the board of each hospital system, because infection prevention reports and report outs are required from a regulatory body to go all the way to our board. So this is a voice that can definitely be in your corner. So how would it all end? Well, IUSS, using a process monitoring structure and tool, was eliminated to 99.9% due to vendor issues. But it is a struggle and it is real, and you have to continually work on it. And that's why you need process monitoring to do that. That's why process monitoring has to be that infrastructure. Metrics have to continue, although the definitions of what was acceptable and unacceptable are no longer written on the board. Numbers are still written in red, yellow, and green. They're still highlighted and they're still talked about. But there are many opportunities and times where they're not having to be mentioned because they've had no cases, but yet they continue to monitor. They've also created some internal competition and a reward system. No cases at risk for the week, potluck for everybody. So everybody gets together celebrating a successful week, which keeps people motivated and focused on the right reasons. And it's process monitoring, so it will never end. Just like our regulatory agencies coming to audit us, process monitoring must be our infrastructure. We know anytime a regulatory agency shows up in our buildings, because of our process monitoring, IUSS will not be an issue, and our patients will be ultimately safer. And by using this structure, we don't get stressed. There's no need to run around and check IUSS logs because we know we looked at them every day. There's no cleanup, there's no validation, there's no worry because these were managed each and every day. And from my perspective, when I think process monitoring, I learned quite early in my career from a chief quality officer that you should never let perfect be the enemy of good. Because anytime you get into this type of work, the goal is not perfection. The goal is better each and every day because that's what we owe our patients. I appreciate the opportunity to talk to you all. And with that, I'm going to open it up for questions.
Okay, Melissa, thank you so much. That was great. You know, I've been in facilities, as you kind of mentioned, the punishment culture that is surrounded by audits. You know, I would say that audits could be a four-letter word, although it's not 4 letters. But I could just feel the stress and anxiety when people, you know, clinicians or SPD techs, however, they just would know when they're getting a visit, and all of a sudden their normal day would change, or their week or their month if they knew a specific day. And, you know, I call it the gotcha culture. And that just, it's a really tough way to operate because there's no consistency and there's no repetitiveness. It just, you're doing something to mask, you know, what is happening in the moment, as opposed to really having something lined out to where the anxiety is just non-existent.
Absolutely.
You know, so one of the questions I wanted to ask you before we get into some of the deep part of this is, do you use one knife when you are doing the peanut butter and jelly sandwich, or are you using 2 for jelly and peanut butter?
So sometimes I use 3, Brett. Sometimes I use 3. Depends on whether I need to redip, right?
Awesome. So let's hop in. You know, we have a comment on how some infection preventionists aren't necessarily proactive, or they're not very active in their facilities. Do you have some examples on how infection preventionists can be more active and be more involved in departments?
Oh, absolutely. That's a great question, Brett, because as many of us in healthcare, we are extremely challenged with staffing as just a universal problem. And infection prevention is experiencing that well. For several years, the organization as a whole has talked about the great resignation that's coming, and I think COVID helped articulate that. So we have a lot of infection preventionists that are coming into the department that don't necessarily, they've never even been in the OR. So it starts by establishing that partnership. How do I, as an infection preventionist, learn more about the OR or sterile processing departments? And we have to create a culture where we accept that person into our teams as sterile processors and help them understand the work. Because I'm going to see the work one way and you're going to see another. Because if I come in with my audit tool, I'm never going to understand the nuances of what a sterile processor does, and it's way bigger than looking at just a blank AMI standard, right? I need to spend some time in the space being able to ask questions about what you do, understand why you may do it this way versus another way, understanding how the IFU creates some grayness to your zone. So one thing that I'm doing here at Orlando Health is really establishing a very clear competency and orientation pathway for the space of sterile processing, because you need to spend time there. Just as important as it is for me to understand nursing perspectives or facility perspectives, is key that I've spent time in these areas to understand how the work really happens before I can help set that culture. And I think that goes a long way, right? Because if I've come down in a humble perspective of, I've never worked in sterile processing, I need somebody to teach me how you do your work, in that humble way, I can also help establish that culture better.
Yep. No, that's a great answer. I think that goes back to Anna's presentation earlier about the team culture and really working together as one. And I can provide an example when I was on the vendor side that I would go into hospitals and it wouldn't be to sell a product. It would be to work together as a team to help define some processes that helped infection prevention, sterile processing, and nursing work together. And I also had that accountability as a vendor to really work with them and help with some of the processes. And it was really interesting to see some of the interactions to where when they would go in and work in a department, or they'd sit and observe, or just look and have somebody show them how something worked, how, say, the application of a pre-treatment spray, as opposed to telling. I'm always a proponent of showing versus telling.
Yes.
And it was really pretty remarkable to see kind of that transformation of, we all have a hand in this process and we can all help each other.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So I'm going to hop into a question here. One of the questions is, how do we get to the point where we are always doing it right when the very nature of SPD is to produce now, and the consistent nature of the OR to add more and more to produce revenue?
Absolutely. So there's a balance between revenue and right? So if I continually use a process with gaps in it, you will continually be challenged to meet the revenue standards in which organizations are setting. And so I think that's one way infection prevention leaders can also help set that stage in that context. And we can do that by showing how that error slows down the process, creates safety concerns, which cost the organization money. So we as a profession need to help set that stage and partner with the teams differently. And then there has to be some culture between the OR and SPD. This is not a top-down dissemination, although most organizations it's set up that way structurally, because you got to have that physician with that specialty to perform that surgery, right? So that's how it becomes top-down. However, if we can get all those people in the room to say, what do you need to be successful, then we can have some shared goals. This is not a perfect process, and we've had many, many years of audit culture and a culture of top-down, but we got to stop somewhere. We got to intervene. And so take even something that you may consider as a small process problem and make a change. Because eventually you're going to make changes that your culture all of a sudden is that we do this right every time. Right.
And then, the small processes that may have some gaps can turn into big ones. So identifying them up front, the question or the point of being proactive is, you can't say that enough. And it's always hard to foresee problems, but the reactive nature of problem solving just puts you behind, because then you're putting out fires all the time. So, I think the more you refine those processes, the less those fires burn, or they don't burn as hot.
Absolutely, absolutely. And to stop treating everything like a fire, right?
Right.
I mean, there are certain fires, but, you know, if I'm only looking at a data point monthly, that fire seems really big and unobtainable versus putting it down, you know, to what is something I can control that would then impact. And by mapping out work, sometimes that's helpful. And that's where you get that engagement and culture. Culture change takes 3 to 5 years. That's well studied, well published, but it starts with your actions today. Because when you look down the road 3 years ago, you won't even believe where you were.
Yep. Yeah, and I really liked the chart that you showed as far as, you know, the monitoring the surgical cases and some of the gaps there. I think the more that you have something in place like that, that you just institute into the process and it becomes repetitive, it's just part of your day. And you see the data points that you showed, you see the improvement, it's visual. And that's a really, really good point that you made, that the visual improvement really helps emphasize and bring forward the need for just repetition. I'm a big fan of repetition because it breeds, you know, consistency. So,
absolutely.
And also over communicating, right? You can never communicate enough.
Right. Absolutely.
And the more that you communicate, the more it just becomes just a day-to-day process. Let's see. How do we set the culture on a standard that can be interpreted differently between leaders in IP within the facility?
So that struggle is real, and I think that there's some onus on us as infection preventionists to ask those rules, but sometimes it just starts by my immediate connection. So if I have a sterile processing department, how do I partner with them to understand what the standards are that meet the national or regulatory standards? And then we write those instructions together. You know, I'm not telling you to use one knife. I'm not telling you to use two. I'm asking the people who do the work, what makes the most sense? And if I use one knife, what risk do I need to mitigate, right? Because if I use one knife, then I've dipped it in the peanut butter and the jelly. So now I've got peanut butter in the jelly jar, or the opposite way. So once the team says, well, we need one knife because it's faster. But then I say, well, you got to mitigate the risk of mixing. So then they say, oh, no, let's just use two knives, right? So that's where that collaboration and that partnership gets us to a rule that's easy to understand. Because now I have a set of standards that say, when I'm at the sink, I'm going to use two, or I'm in my kitchen making a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, I have to have two knives. I, as an infection preventionist, know very easily if you're not using two knives, because that's the rules we agreed upon.
Right. Yeah. I love that analogy. And I think I'll probably be thinking about this every time I make a peanut butter and jelly sandwich going forward. And this is actually kind of piggybacks onto that. Standardization fails, in my opinion, when a process cannot be agreed upon. Hence your peanut butter and jelly sandwich analogy. Does one person use both knives to handle the bread and get the containers, or should we have the staffing to do it the right way all the time with the same speed all the time? SPD varies way too much for standards that cannot define how the processes should look. So what are your thoughts? I think that this probably is a good complement to what you just talked about.
Yeah. So, you know, I understand that it varies, but yet it does not, right? Like, you have a sink, it's set up a certain way in your department, right? So with that team, you can very much get together and determine what would work, how long does it take, if I do this, this is the outcome. And is it really taking more time? That's where you do things like time studies. That's where you engage with the team. That's where you get the bandwidth to say, you know what, because we don't have the right knife, maybe we need a double ended knife, right? Then I would have one knife, but I could use both ends. I don't have any mitigation problems. And then I, as the infection preventionist, say, in order to not slow down, we need to spend 32 cents more on a knife, but it yet mitigates $150,000 of an issue with a patient getting cross contamination. So that's where that partnership with both our OR partners, our infection preventionists, our finance teams need to be a part of the why behind the solution. But it's got to start with the person at the sink. It's got to start with the team member doing the work, because they know what's going to work and what's going to take more time than the other. And so you start there and you start small. Don't eat the entire elephant. And usually that's a slide that I've included previously, Brett, into some of my presentations, because it does seem so overwhelming. There's so much work. There's so many IFUs. There's so many opportunities for improvement. But just pick one that you really feel like you could make a difference on. Start there. Because I'm telling you, you pick one, it becomes contagious. You get people engaged. You're shifting the culture. You're showing them and visually celebrating change and difference and success. That's contagious.
Oh, yeah.
People want to come to work to be successful. And so we can help boost that up.
Oh, for sure. And yeah, if one thing works, it's almost addictive, right? It's like, wow, we just honed in on this process that seems really overwhelming, and we've been kind of glazing over it for a number of months or years or however long, but we actually took the time to make some subtle improvements and look at how much more efficient we are. So then it's like, that one is there, let's move on to the next. And then the next, and then it just, like you said, it becomes very contagious. It's awesome.
It is awesome. It is really awesome.
So I kind of want to shift a little bit in the time we have here, because I want to ask your opinion. I was, as you know, on the vendor side, and I wanted to get your feedback on the involvement with the vendors in this process, because we've got tray delivery delays, we've got issues on that end. And, I believe and feel that this is a team process again, and the vendors need to be engaged, they need to be involved, and even part of some of the team meetings even. So what's your feeling on that?
I always agree, you got to start with the stakeholders. We don't do process. If we do processes to other people, we are auditing them. A process involves everybody who touches the process from the start to the finish. And, vendor, anybody who's ancillary. So just as much as IUSS affects the OR, it affects them in a certain way. It affects the SPD department in a certain way. It affects the instrumentation in a certain way, and the vendor in a certain way, right? So if you can get all those people together first, everybody gets really good insight into how the bad outcome affects them, right? Because nobody knows what everybody does. I mean, we always say we know how it works, but we don't, right? I mean, literally, unless I do the work every day, I have no idea. So if I can bring all those people in together in a collaborative partnership, we will find a solution that would just knock it out of the park. But we also need to push back on some of our industries to help us all, right? Like, we got to quit being vague with instructions, because we even put the vendor in a challenge, right? They've been given a piece of equipment. It says X, but that doesn't relay to the team in a way that makes it really efficient. So that industry engagement and that industry ownership and being very specific, making sure that they're not creating processes that are impossible for our teams to do, whether it be a vendor getting the instrumentation because you only get 2 of these for a regional area where they're expected to do 200, right? That would be an impact on them having availability, to an IFU that's almost impossible to follow for a team.
Yeah.
So I think that's where we've got to get as an industry. That's why I love being a part of these types of presentations, because I feel like you get that that audience to start having those crucial conversations.
Right. Yeah. And you mentioned the IFUs, and I've seen so many that it's almost like another language, and trying to decipher the instructions, or, I mean, wondering what they mean. And you pointed it out, the vagueness of some of the instructions when it comes to cleaning and decontamination. It's really important that the vendors understand it, but they can explain it. And then also that clinicians can understand it and then have that process lined out, saying, okay, well, they said to flush the lumens, but what do you do? Well, how do you determine the outcome on that? So it's always, what's the result? And I think we can always get into a long discussion about IFUs, but well, Melissa, I want to really thank you for joining us. We're at time. It was a great presentation. It's a great discussion. And as always, it's great to see you, great to be working with you again. And if anybody out there has questions for Melissa, you can reach out to her through LinkedIn. She's available and very communicative there. Also, her contact information is located on your screen in the bio. So if you do have any additional questions after this conversation and presentation, please feel to reach out. And Melissa, we once again thank you. We will see everybody here in about 15 minutes for our next session. Don't go away. We'll be right back.